Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about how to compose an answering phrase. Well, let's just think, what do I mean by an answering phrase? Well, if you're a composer, the temptation is to just deliver an endless stream of notes that don't really get organized in any way in terms of how maybe the phrase structure works. Are you writing in 4-bar phrases, 4-measure phrases, or 2 bars, 2 measures at a time? Are you balancing your phrases so you've got 4 here, then you've got 2 2s there, or perhaps a long 8-bar, 8-measure phrase somewhere? All important stuff to thinking about. But sometimes when you're writing, it's a very good idea to have pairs of phrases that balance each other. So you almost have one phrase that asks a musical question and then another phrase that provides some kind of answer. So you're kind of taking the listener on a journey from here to there, and then you're responding by starting at that point and going somewhere else, or coming back to base, whatever it happens to be. Now, if you kept on doing the same kind of question and answer all the way through the piece, that could be a bit tedious as well. But it's a very useful thing to do. What I find lots of people do when they start to write a piece of music, either they're just writing an endless stream of notes, or they're writing a phrase, and then they write another phrase that's got nothing to do with it, and then they write another phrase that's got nothing to do with that. So here's a phrase that I've put on the screen for you. We're actually in the key of E minor, and the phrase goes like this. Okay, there's the starter. Now, if I then went, it'd be kind of like, well, what's that got to do with the first phrase? It just suddenly goes off on one and, charges about the landscape in a sort of rather manic way. So it doesn't kind of really fit. What happens if I did the opposite? Well, I suppose it works in its own funny way, but it's a bit kind of like boring, isn't it, really? It's not really going anywhere. So there's a danger, isn't there, of doing something that doesn't belong to it, either because you've got completely different kind of notes, completely different balance of what's going by step, what's leaping, or the rhythms are so totally different, it doesn't belong. So when you listen to this phrase, it feels like a kind of musical question, doesn't it? You couldn't really sort of stop and go home now. You've got to write something else that goes on the back of that. But if it's a 2-bar musical question, maybe we want some kind of 2-bar musical answer. So one thing we can do, I'm going to give you some different possibilities. We could adopt the same rhythm, adopt the same rhythm, and just come up with a different melody that maybe goes somewhere else. One little warning shot about this one. It starts on B, it finishes on B, and it's got other Bs on the way. So maybe in the answering phrase, we've used so many Bs in the questioning phrase, if you like, you might want to start on B again or not, but you may just want to get away from the Bs a little bit. Anyway, one thing you could do would be to have the same rhythm. So if we did something like, let's start on a different note so we get away from these Bs, and then I'm going to write something on the same rhythm, but different notes. So how about we have an answering phrase that sounds like that? Exactly the same rhythm, different notes. What does this sound like? Here's the questioning phrase. And now the answer. Hope you spotted the deliberate mistake. I forgot to make that a semiquaver or a 16th note. But you hear how that works? The second phrase belongs to the first phrase because the rhythm is the same. You kind of hear that. Also, the second phrase, the answering phrase, takes us on a different kind of journey. We've got all these Bs. Then we move to a G. There's a B, but it's an octave lower. And then we're finishing off by centering on E. And if we're in the key of E minor, E is the tonic, the first degree of the scale. So it really feels as if we've gone home. The first phrase was starting on the 5th degree of the scale, what we call the dominant. So it was kind of sitting in the air a bit. So now the second phrase kind of brings us back home again. So that would be one possible answering phrase. Now you might say, yeah, well, that might sound all right, but I'd quite like to write something with a different rhythm. That's fine. Well, maybe we could do something with a different rhythm, but it's not 100 miles away from the original rhythm, because if you do something that's totally different, then it doesn't belong to it. So we could do something like this. How about this as a different answering phrase? I start with a different rhythm, and then I have some of the same rhythm, but some of it's different. So how about we do something like this? I'm still sort of thinking about trying to finish on an E because we had that first phrase so dominated by those Bs. So this time I'll play the questioning phrase with this answering phrase. So you see how the second phrase balances the first phrase perfectly well, but this time we've got a more independent rhythm. One thing you might want to think about is what's the balance of conjunct and disjunct movement? What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm going from a note to its next door note, then we're just going to neighbouring notes. That's called conjunct movement. If I'm leaping between one note and the next, that's called disjunct movement. So when we look at the given phrase, well, we've got these 3 repeated notes, haven't we? And then we're kind of going disjunct. It's not very far, we're only going what we call a third, 3 notes. There's another disjunct. There's another disjunct which is now wider. Then we've got conjunct to finish. What have I done in this answering phrase? I've gone conjunct to there, conjunct, conjunct, but then I've gone disjunct in one direction followed by disjunct in the other direction. That's often a good thing to do. If you have disjunct in one direction, come back in the other direction. Disjunct, disjunct. But this is wider, that's a 5th. This is wide-ish, it's a 4th. And these are narrower because they're 3rd. So even when you're writing disjunct, well, how wide is your disjunct movement? How close is it? What have I done in this answering phrase down here? This is entirely conjunct. Do you see? I'm just going by step all the way through. Now, does that work? Well, it does, because we've had a fair bit of disjunct going on in the first phrase. Having a more conjunct second phrase kind of might help just smooth things out a little bit. So there's kind of balance in all that to think about as well. It's also quite good to think about what's the direction of a melody. If you look at the opening phrase, we start on B, we finish on B, as we've said, and we've had a lot of Bs. So it's kind of centering around this B, isn't it? And then it's kind of notes moving from there, but we keep coming back to B. So one thing you don't want is an answering phrase that has a load of Bs in it, because if I do the questioning phrase, and then I have loads more Bs, we're kind of B'd out by the end of those 4 bars, aren't we? Those 4 measures. So we don't want to be stuck in the same place. So the idea of moving somewhere else is quite good. But that kind of sits on a sort of flat line, but it comes down and it goes up again in the middle. So it has this sort of little bit of a shape that does that, doesn't it? Well, what happens with this one? It starts here, it just goes up a notch, it comes down, then it sort of comes up and down again. So it's got a slightly different shape. This one has got a shape that comes down, nudges up and comes down. So it's got a different shape again. Sometimes thinking about the shape of a phrase and how one phrase might contrast the other is another good thing to think about. But anyway, the main point is just to kind of start thinking about when we're composing a melody, don't just think, well, I've written another bar or another measure, so what am I going to do next? I'm going to stick on yet another bar and then another one and then another one until I've glued together sufficient bars or measures to make a piece of music, because it won't work very well. You might want to think about, what's the structure of my overall piece? For example, am I going to have 3 sections, A, B, A? So the first section, the second section that contrasts in some way, a third section that relives the first section or slightly modifies it. That's your overall structure. Now we're beginning to think about your internal structure. Having got all that external structure in place, how's the internal structure going to work? And this is where thinking about, I've written a 2-bar phrase or a 2-measure phrase. Now, how am I going to answer that in the next 2 bars or the next 2 measures? And then what am I going to do? Am I going to write another pair of 2-bar, 2-measure phrases? Or this time, am I not going to do that? Am I going to write one longer phrase of 4 bars or 4 measures? This will help you to write a piece of music that hangs together much better and has an internal structure as well as an external structure. So I think learning how to compose an answering phrase is a very useful compositional technique. So if you're trying to build confidence with composition, just giving yourself a 2-bar, 2-measure phrase, then trying to write various different kinds of answering phrases and thinking, well, okay, now I've written 5 or 6 of these. Which one works best? Which one am I happy with? Which ones am I not happy with, and what was wrong with them? So you can kind of learn for next time. But I think it's a really useful thing to do. So there we are, how to compose an answering phrase. Well, if you found this video helpful, let me invite you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. When you get to the homepage, click on Courses and then make your way to a course that's called Composition. Because if you're kind of building your skills in learning to compose and wondering how to go about doing all this, that course will give you lots of clues into what you're doing with melodies and rhythms and what you're doing with chords, how you're structuring your piece and all the rest of it. So it will take you on from this point and deliver something that will be helpful in that direction. www.mmcourses.co.uk